It's a little after 3 in the morning on November 29th, 1944, in the cold black water off the coast of Honshu, and the largest warship in the world is about to die without ever launching a single airplane. Her name is Shishano. She is 72,000 tons of steel, a hull originally laid down as the third Yamamoto class battleship, then converted, in a near panic after the carrier slaughter at Midway, into the biggest aircraft carrier anyone on Earth had ever built. The Japanese believed she was unsinkable. They built her in total secrecy behind the walls of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, specifically so the American B 29s couldn't find her and bomb her on the ways. She had an armored flight deck, a waterline belt as much as 16 inches thick, and a crew of 2,400 men. On paper, she was a floating fortress. On her maiden voyage, barely out of the harbor, watertight doors still unfinished, pumps missing from critical compartments, half her crew strangers to their own ship. She crossed paths with a single American submarine. The boat was USS Archerfish, a Baleo-class fleet submarine. Her skipper was Commander Joseph Enright, a man who earlier in the war had essentially given up on himself, resigned a command, asked for a desk. This was his redemption patrol. When his radar operator first picked up the contact, the story goes that he told Enright the island they'd been watching was moving. That island was Shinano. Enright tracked her on the surface in the dark for 6 hours. The Japanese commander, Toshio Abe, had convinced himself he was being shadowed by a whole wolf pack. That this one little boat was just a decoy. So he zigzagged conservatively and never turned to hunt her down. Around 3:15 in the morning, the carrier swung across the submarine's track and gave Enright her entire broadside. He fired 6 torpedoes. 4 of them hit. A few hours later, the largest warship ever sank by a submarine rolled over and went to the bottom, taking more than 1,400 men with her. She never flew an airplane. She never fired a shot in anger. The symbol of Japanese naval power, the carrier, was killed by the weapon we spent 80 years forgetting. I want to sit in that image for a second because this is a personal essay, and I want to be honest about what that means. This is my argument, my opinion, built on the research and on the years of looking at the sea the way a sailor learns to. It is not the final verdict of history. Serious people disagree with me, and I'll give them their say before we're done. But here's the argument stated plainly, no hedging. The submarine, not the aircraft carrier, won the Pacific War. I know how that sounds. We all grew up on the carrier war. Pearl Harbor, then Midway as the great turning point. Then the fast carrier task forces sweeping west, island by island, and finally the bomb. The carrier is the face of that war. It's on the documentaries, the book covers, the recruiting posters. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that Midway didn't matter or those carrier crews weren't magnificent. They were. And I love those battles as much as anyone listening. That, it turns out, is part of the problem. I'll get into it. But step back and look at what actually killed Japan, not what was dramatic, what was lethal. I spent my time in the Navy as a machinist mate. My world was the engineering plant, the spaces down below the waterline that nobody ever puts on a poster. And when I look at how Shinano died, I don't see bad luck. I see a ship that lost the one fight that decides whether a hull lives or dies. The fight for watertight integrity. 4 torpedoes should not sink a 72,000-ton carrier. They sank that one because her damage control wasn't ready. The doors weren't dogged. The pumps weren't aboard. The crew didn't know their own compartments. A submarine found the scene and worked it. And that, to me, is the entire war in miniature. Japan was an empire built on water. Everything that made her dangerous, the oil, the iron ore, the rubber, the rice, had to come to her across the sea in the hulls of merchant ships. The thing that found the scene in that empire and exploited it patiently, compartment by compartment, ship by ship, until the whole structure flooded and rolled over. That was not the carrier, it was the boat. The carriers fought the battles we remember. The submarines fought the war that actually mattered. And they did it mostly in the dark, mostly unwitnessed, for almost none of the credit. So, why has this question been answered wrong for so long? Why do we hand the carrier the trophy and leave the men in the boats a footnote? So let me do the thing a fair argument actually requires. Before I take the carrier story apart, I have to build it back up. Honestly, completely, at full strength. Because an essay is only as good as its position it's arguing against. And the carrier story is not some lazy myth somebody invented for a movie poster. It is a serious, well-supported reading of the war, held by serious people. And it became the dominant story for reasons that are mostly good ones. If I'm going to tell you it's incomplete, I owe you the strongest version of it first. It starts before the war even begins, with a man named Alfred Thayer Mahon. Mahon was an American naval officer and historian, and in 1890 he wrote a book that did something rare. It changed how the great powers thought about the sea. His argument boiled down was this: sea power wins wars, and you win sea power by concentrating your biggest, most powerful ships, finding the enemy's main fleet, and destroying it in one decisive battle. Command of the sea won in an afternoon. And what about going after the enemy's merchant ship, his commerce? The guerre de cours, as the old French phrase had it. Mahon dismissed it. A nuisance, he said. Annoying, never decisive. Real navies fight real fleets. That idea didn't just shape the US Navy, it went global. The British believed it, the Germans believed it, and the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it most devoutly of all. They built an entire war plan around it and gave it a name: Kantai Konsen, the decisive battle. Japan's whole strategy was to lure the American fleet across the Pacific and smash it in one grand engagement. Both navies, on both sides of the ocean, walked into the war expecting the same thing: a decisive battle between capital ships. So, when the war came, everyone was watching for that battle. And here's the genius of the conventional story: the carrier delivered it. Pearl Harbor proved that carriers could cross an ocean undetected and cripple a battle fleet in a morning. Then came June of 1942 and Midway. The Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval formation on the planet at the moment, sailed against Midway. And in the span of a few minutes, American dive bombers turned 4 Japanese fleet carriers into burning wrecks. 4 irreplaceable carriers, and the trained air crews with them, gone in a day. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the whole thing, turned his fleet around and went home. And out of Midway flows the entire clean, satisfying arc of the war as most people know it. Midway is the turning point, the moment the tide turns. It buys the United States the breathing room to build the great Essex-class carriers coming off the ways back home. Those carriers then anchor the island-hopping campaign, providing the air cover that lets the Marines take island after island, until the fast carrier task forces are sitting off the coast of Japan itself. It's a beautiful story. It has a clear hinge, named heroes, and a visible, dramatic climax to every chapter. And then it got written down permanently by the right person. After the war, the Navy's official historian was Samuel Eliot Morison, a Harvard man who actually went to sea to write it. 15 volumes of it. The standard work for generations. And here's a detail I find quite telling. When Morrison wrote up the carrier triumphs of 1942, the volume was titled Coral Sea, Midway, and Submarine Actions. The submarines, the weapon I'm going to argue won the war, appear in the official history as a subtitle, an afterthought, tacked onto the end of the carrier story. Now, here's why I'm not sneering at any of this. Because so much of it is simply correct. The carrier did replace the battleship as the capital ship of the modern Navy. That's not a myth. That's true, and it's still true today. Midway was a genuine hinge. The initiative really did pass to the Americans there. The men who flew those planes and fought those battles were as brave and as skilled as we remember them. And the doctrine fit. Everybody had spent 50 years expecting a decisive battle, and the carriers seemed to hand them one. When the story you find matches the story you were already looking for, you stop looking. That's not stupidity. That's human. There's the seam. Won the battles and won the war are two different sentences, and the carrier story makes its living in the gap between them. So let me do what an engineer does when he suspects a hull isn't as sound as it looks. You don't argue with it. You go below the waterline, you put your hand on the actual plating, and you find the cracks. I've got 5 of them, and every one is a specific fact, not a feeling. Crack number 1. The largest carrier battle ever fought, bigger than Midway, bigger than anything, was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June of 1944. 24 carriers in the water. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where the American aviators shot Japanese planes out of the sky by the hundreds. The single most lopsided carrier engagement in history. And here's the detail nobody puts on the poster. Of the 3 Japanese carriers sunk in that battle, the American carrier planes got exactly 1, a light carrier. The other 2 were the Taiho and the Shokaku, the 2 best flat tops in the Imperial fleet, and they were not sunk by aircraft at all. The Taiho was torpedoed by the submarine Albacore. The Shokaku was torpedoed by the submarine Kavala. And at the greatest carrier battle in human history, the heaviest blows were struck from underwater. Crack number 2. 4 months later came Leyte Gulf, and the Japanese carriers, the war-winning weapon, supposedly, sailed into battle as bait. Admiral Ozawa took 6 carriers north with barely 100 aircraft among them, total. And his entire mission was to be seen, to be chased, to be sacrificed so the real attack could slip through. Think about that. The capital ship of the modern Navy reduced to a decoy with empty decks. Why? Because the Turkey Shoot had killed off Japan's trained naval aviators, and there was no fuel left to train new ones. The carriers were still floating. They just had nothing to fly, and no one to fly it. And that points straight at crack number 3, which is the big one. The fleet that was built to fight Muhan's decisive battle couldn't move. By 1944, American submarines had sent something like 2/3 of Japan's oil tankers to the bottom. The combined fleet, the most powerful surface navy in the Pacific, had to go park itself down at Singapore and an anchorage called Tawi Tawi, thousands of miles from home, just to sit close to the oil. The last tanker from the southern oil fields reached the home islands in March of 1945. After that, the imports simply stopped. They had school children digging up pine roots to distill into a few thousand barrels of garbage aviation fuel so contaminated it wrecked the engines it was poured into. That is not a Navy that lost a battle. That is a Navy that was strangled. Crack number 4 makes it personal because it's the Yamamoto, the biggest battleship ever built. 70,000 tons, 18-inch guns, the pride of the Imperial Navy. Her final mission in April 1945, Operation Tengo, was a one-way trip. They sent her against the American fleet at Okinawa with barely enough fuel aboard to get there and none to come back. The mightiest warship in the world couldn't manage a round trip. Tell me that's a war decided by gunfire and not by an empty fuel bunker. And crack number 5 is the deepest because it tells you the US Navy didn't even believe its own story. Muhan had taught for 50 years that hunting the enemy's merchant ships was a nuisance, never decisive. The decisive battle doctrine was gospel. And yet, with the smoke still rising over Pearl Harbor, the order that went out from Washington wasn't find their fleet and destroy it. It was, in plain language, execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. The very first strategic decision of the Pacific War was to do the exact thing the doctrine said could never win it. So now, stand back and look at the pattern. Every time you press on the carrier story, the biggest carrier battle, the showcase victories, the proud capital ships, your hand goes right through it, and underneath you find a submarine, or an empty fuel tank that a submarine emptied. The carriers won the days we remember. The boats were winning the war on every single one of the days in between. So let me build it the other way now. Not what the carrier story gets wrong, but what the submarine story gets right. I'm going to do it with names, dates, and numbers because an argument like mine doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. So it has to earn every inch. Start with the ledger because somebody actually kept it. After the war, a joint Navy-Army committee went through both sides' records, hull by hull, to settle who sank what. Their verdict: American submarines sank 54.6% of every Japanese ship lost in the entire war. Call it 4,800,000 tons of merchant shipping. And it wasn't only freighters and tankers. The boats also sank around 30% of the Imperial Navy's warship tonnage, including a battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. More than half the ships and a third of the warships sunk by submarines. Now, set that against one more number. The submarine force was less than 2% of the Navy's manpower. 2% of the men sank more than 2% of the men sank more than 55% of the enemy's ships. That 2% was awarded 7 Medals of Honor. I've read a lot of military history, and I cannot find leverage like that anywhere else. A sliver of a force doing the majority of the killing. And you don't have to take it from me, because the man in command said it himself. Admiral Chester Nimitz ran the whole Pacific. And here's a fact that matters. Nimitz was a submariner by trade. He'd qualified in boats early in his career. In 1949, he wrote the foreword to the Navy's official history of the submarine war, written by Theodore Roscoe. And he didn't hedge. He said that when he took command after Pearl Harbor, the boats were the only units of the fleet that could come to grips with the Japanese for months to come. It was the submarine force, he said, that he looked to carry the load while the rest of the fleet was rebuilt. The boats held the line. That is not some revisionist with a podcast. That is the theater commander, a submariner himself, telling you who carried the war while the outcome was still in doubt. Then there's the strangulation. And the good news is somebody measured it. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey went into Japan after the surrender and put numbers on the collapse. Of the supplies Japan tried to ship to her own soldiers in the field, the survey found that 17% was sunk in 1943, 30% in 1944, and 50% in 1945. Read that climb again. By the last year of the war, half of everything Japan tried to send to her troops went to the bottom of the sea. That is not a country that lost a battle. That is a country being slowly cut off from its own arms and legs. Put one night on it so it stops being a stick. December 22nd, 1944. A single American submarine, USS Flasher, off the coast of Indochina, finds a convoy in the dark and in one attack sends 3 loaded tankers down. One of them, the Arita Maru, 3 full tankers, 3 shiploads of oil that would never reach a carrier's bunkers, a fighter's tank, a destroyer's boilers. Here is where I get to tell you something a man at a desk cannot. I stood those watches. I was a machinist mate. My world was the engineering plant below the waterline, in the heat and the noise where fuel becomes motion. So let me tell you what a sunk tanker actually means down there. A warship without fuel is not a warship. It's a steel building. It can't make speed. It can't make steam. It can't run its pumps or its blowers or its generators. And a ship that can't generate power can't fight, can't even keep the lights on. Everything a warship does, every knot, every salvo, every degree of rudder, starts in the fire room with oil. When Flasher put those 3 tankers down, she didn't just sink steel and cargo. She reached into the fire rooms of every ship that oil was promised to and shut them down cold. I know exactly what that silence feels like, because keeping that plant breathing was my job, and I know what it is when the fuel isn't there. So there's the affirmative case, and it stands on its own feet. The boats sank the majority of the fleet and the lifeblood that ran it. The commander, a submariner, said they held the line. The survey measured the strangulation year over rising year. And a man who has stood in the fire room can tell you the empty bunker a submarine creates is every bit as lethal as the torpedo that creates it. I promised I wouldn't dodge it, so now I'm going to build the case against myself. And I'm going to build it strong, because a personal essay that only argues with weaklings isn't worth your time. If I can't make you for the next few minutes genuinely wonder whether I'm wrong, then I haven't earned the right to tell you I'm right. The ejection comes in 3 waves, and each one is harder than the last. Wave 1. The submarines were nearly useless in the year that mattered most. In 1942, when the war truly hung in the balance, the boats barely scratched Japan. And here's the brutal part. It wasn't the enemy's fault. It was ours. The standard issue Mark 14 torpedo was a lemon. It ran too deep. That magnetic exploder fired early or not at all. And the contact pin crushed itself on a square hit instead of detonating. Skippers watched perfect shots thud against hulls and do nothing. And the man who wrote the definitive history of the submarine war, Clay Blair, whose book Silent Victory is the backbone of my whole argument, spends chapter after chapter documenting that fiasco. The torpedoes weren't truly fixed until the fall of 1943. So, for the most desperate stretch of the entire war, my war-winning weapon was firing duds, while the carriers were winning midway. You cannot hand the trophy to a weapon that spent the crisis years missing. Wave 2 is the big one, the one I named a minute ago. The submarines only ran wild later, and they ran wild because the carriers had already won the sea. Think about what it actually took for a boat to get fat, hunting in 1944. Someone had to win command of the ocean, so the subs weren't the ones being hunted. Someone had to seize the island bases, the Marianas, the forward anchorages, so the boats could refuel and rearm thousands of miles from home. And someone had to break the Japanese codes so the skippers knew where the convoys would be. The carriers and the fast fleet did the first 2. The codebreakers did the third. This is the carrier primacy reading you'll find in Samuel Eliot Morison's official history, and it's strong. Worse for me, the Strategic Bombing Survey, the very document I quoted from my side, describes the whole effort as one integrated machine. Air search, finding targets for the subs. Fear of subs driving ships into harbors where carrier planes destroyed them. Mines herding ships back into submarine waters. Pull the carrier out of that machine and the submarine starves. So maybe what I've been calling the submariner's victory is really the carrier's victory wearing a different hat. Wave 3 is the one that hurts a Navy man to admit. Even if you grant me the blockade, the submarine wasn't even the whole blockade. It was the last 5 months of the war. The B-29s flew Operation Starvation, seeding something like 12,000 mines in Japan's home waters, with under 6% of their sorties. And in that final stretch, those bombers sank more ships than the submarines did. By some accounting, roughly 60% of all shipping losses from March to August of 1945, at a cost of about 15 aircraft. Air Force analysts, men like Colonel John Chilstrom, in his study Mines Away, argue convincingly that mine for mine, plane for plane, the airmen got more for less than the boats did. And it was Admiral Nimitz himself who pushed for that mining campaign. So even the strangulation I'm so proud of was, by the end, as much an air show as an undersea one. And there's a fourth thing lurking beneath all three. The question that can swallow the whole argument. Even if the blockade was decisive, the blockade didn't make Japan sign the surrender. 2 atomic bombs and a Soviet declaration of war did that, inside a single week in August 1945. A great many serious historians will tell you the empire was strangled, but not surrendering. And that's something else entirely. Not a torpedo, not a mine, not a carrier plane, finally broke its will. Now, let me be honest about how much of that is correct, because most of it is. The torpedo scandal is real and shameful. The dependence on sea control on the bases, on the codebreakers, is real. The air mining numbers at the end are real and genuinely remarkable. And the surrender question is honestly unsettled. Anyone who tells you my thesis is airtight is selling you something. So here's the line that the whole thing turns on, and I want you to hold on to it. The door is not the knife. Opening a door and killing what's behind it are 2 different acts, done by 2 different hands. Keep that in your head, and let's walk back through all 3 waves. Wave 1. The boats were useless in 1942 with their broken torpedoes. Listen to what that objection actually is. It's not a complaint about submarines. It's a complaint about the Bureau of Ordnance, the desk-bound office that handed those crews a defective weapon and then, for almost 2 years, refused to believe its own skippers when they reported it. That's a scandal, and it's a scandal of bureaucracy, not of strategy. Because look what happened the moment somebody finally fixed the wrench in the fall of 1943. The leverage was instant and overwhelming. A weapon that becomes that lethal the second it works was never the wrong weapon. It was the right weapon, broken. And even broken, the boats were in the fight. At Midway, 15 submarines formed the scouting line. USS Nautilus, under Lieutenant Commander Brockman, found the Japanese fleet, attacked it, took 42 depth charges, and yes, watched several of her own torpedoes fail to go off. The scandal in miniature. But here's the part that ought to stop you cold. A Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, was peeled off to hunt Nautilus down. When the Arashi gave up and raced at flank speed to rejoin her carriers, an American dive bomber squadron under McCluskey, low on fuel and lost, spotted that destroyer's long white wake and followed it like an arrow straight to the Japanese carriers. The most sacred carrier victory in American history, Midway itself, has a submarine's fingerprints on the murder weapon. Wave 2. The carriers won the sea. So the submarine's victory is really theirs. This is the strong one, and here's where the door and the knife do the work. Sea control is access. It gets you into the room. It's not the same thing as destruction. The carrier opened the door to the Western Pacific. I'll grant that all day. But the killing inside that room was done by the boats. And the causation runs both ways, which nobody on the other side likes to admit. Why did the carriers win so cheaply at the Philippine Sea and the Great Turkey Shoot? Because the Japanese pilots they slaughtered had something like a quarter of the training they should have had. And they had a quarter of the training because the fuel to train them was sitting on the bottom of the South China Sea, put there by submarines. The carrier opened the door, but the submarine had already starved the man waiting behind it. So when the other side says it was all one integrated machine, mutually supporting, I say, exactly. You've just conceded my entire case. Because an integrated machine of attrition is not Muhan's decisive battle. It's the slow logistics war I've been describing. The synergy argument doesn't rescue the carrier story. It surrenders to mine. Wave 3. The B-29 mines outsank the boats at the end. They did, and it's a chronologically trick. Operation Starvation didn't begin until March of 1945, and by March of 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had already been gutted from over 6 million tons down towards 2. The submarines did that across 1943 and 1944, the heavy years. The mines didn't kill a healthy fleet. They administered last rites to a patient the boats had already killed. And the reason submarine sinkings fell in 1945 isn't that the boats got worse, it's that there was almost nothing left to sink. The targets stopped moving. You can't credit the Undertaker with the cause of death. Besides, mining is a blockade. Wave 3 is an argument about which tool of the strangulation delivered the final ton. That's an argument happening inside my thesis, not against it. And the last one, the surrender. Did the bomb and the Soviets end the war? They produced the signature on the document. I'll grant that. But they didn't produce the defeat. By August 1945, the Japanese war machine was already beaten. The fleet couldn't steam. The planes couldn't fly. The factories were starving for the raw materials that were never coming. Admiral Nimitz said it himself, in public, that fall. The atomic bomb played no decisive part in the military defeat of Japan. A boxer gets knocked out by the last punch, but the fight was won by the 10 rounds of body blows that left him too weak to keep his hands up. The blockade was the body blows. The bomb was just the last punch thrown at a man already on his way down. So that's what shifted in me, and it's where I'm going to land. Plainly, no hedging, the way I promised you at the start. The submarine, not the aircraft carrier, won the Pacific War. The boats sank more than half of the enemy's ships and a third of his warships. They strangled the oil and the steel and the rice that an island empire could not live without. And they did it as 2% of the force, in the dark, mostly unwitnessed. That's the claim, and I'll stand on it. But here's the bigger thing the research did to me. The thing I didn't walk in believing. This was never really submarine versus carrier. It was attrition versus the decisive battle. It was the slow, patient, unglamorous war of cutting an enemy off from what keeps him alive, versus the seductive dream of one grand afternoon where you find his fleet and smash it, and the band plays. Alfred Thayer Mahon sold the whole world that dream for 50 years, and both navies marched into the Pacific chasing it. The carriers delivered something that looked like that dream at Midway, and so we crowned them. But the empire didn't die in a decisive afternoon. It died slowly, compartment by compartment, ship by ship, of a wound the submarine opened and never let close. The submarine is just the truest face of the side that actually wins wars. The side that does the patient killing while everyone's watching the spectacle. And I want to be clear about why I'm not telling you a museum story. This argument is live right now, today, and the stakes are real. Because the Navy is having this exact fight again. Pick up proceedings this past year and you'll find the debate raging in print. Is the aircraft carrier the new battleship? a beautiful, beloved, enormously expensive capital ship that technology may have already passed by. China has built the largest navy on Earth by sheer number of hulls, and it has ringed the Western Pacific with carrier killer missiles, hypersonics, drone swarms, and quiet submarines. A wall designed to make the ocean too dangerous for our big decks to enter. And when American analysts run the war games over Taiwan, the force that keeps mattering, and the one that can get into this contested war and do the killing, is the submarine. Manned, armed, nuclear powered attack boats. Now, here's the part that should make the hair on your neck stand up. If you've been listening to this whole episode, we are starving the submarine industrial base. We can barely build 2 attack boats a year. Meanwhile, the carrier still eats the budget and owns the imagination because it's visible, it's grand, it projects the dream of the decisive battle. The same dream Muhan sold. The same one we built the battle fleet around right up until the morning it was sitting in the rows at Pearl Harbor. The old Prussian Clausewitz warned that the defense is the stronger form of war, and China is betting its whole strategy on it. If we misremember who won the last Pacific War, if we tell ourselves it was the spectacle and not the strangulation, we will build the wrong navy for the next one. Getting this history right isn't antiquarian. It's a procurement decision with American lives attached to it. Now, let me tell you why this one is personal, because it is. I was a machinist mate. I spent my Navy years below the waterline, in the heat and the noise of the engineering spaces, doing work that nobody on the flight deck ever saw and nobody back home will ever hear about. And I learned a thing down there that I've carried my whole life. The most important work is almost always the work nobody's watching. The plant that makes the ship move. The fix that keeps the lights on. The quiet, unglamorous labor that makes every visible, glorious thing on the deck above even possible. That's the submarine force for me. 2% of the Navy, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American Armed Forces in the entire war. 52 boats that left the pier and never came home. Still out there on what we call eternal patrol. They did the thing that actually won, and they did it where no camera could find them. And then most of them came home and said nothing and went to work. I've stood in that kind of space they lived and died in. So when I see them writing into history as a subtitle, an afterthought tacked onto the carrier story, it doesn't just strike me as bad history. It strikes me as an injustice to the men who did the hard work, decisive work, that the spotlight never reached. So, what I want you to carry out of this is that the next time you picture the Pacific War and add the boat surfacing in the dark to the reel, that you learn to look past the spectacle in any story to find the patient, unwitnessed work that actually decided it. I invite you, if you feel differently, to come and let me know. I know there are plenty of people, smart people, that disagree with me, and I would love to hear what you think. You can do that through our Discord. You can do that through our X at usnhistory.pod. You can reach out and do that through email at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And you can also let Christoph know that you missed him this week. So, until next time, I want to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.